Welcome to Shutter Up Your Kids, Module 1. So in this module we're going to cover why is the background blurry in your images. But more importantly than that, we're going to look at how to do it deliberately. So in this module you will learn the terms associated with blurring the background of a photo. I know you may not want to know the exact photography terms, but you do need to have a basic understanding of these in order to be able to work this thing. So, the terms associated with blurring the background of a photo in simple language, I promise. I'm going to teach you how to use aperture priority mode. Don't stress, it sounds a lot more complicated than it looks. And when to use that aperture priority mode. So, let's jump straight into it. Now, there are 3 terms you need to know about blurring the background in your photos. Aperture, depth of field, and f-stop. Now, I promise they are not as complicated as they sound, I promise. So we'll look at aperture first. So aperture, the Google definition, trying to research it, it sounds very complicated, but it honestly isn't. Scrap that, let's go with my translation. So my translation is essentially how much light goes into the camera. That's aperture. Really, the only reason you need to know the word aperture is because it is a setting on your camera. So when it comes to taking photos of your kids, you don't really need to know too in depth on that one, so don't stress too much. It's just a term. The next one is depth of field. This one is important. So, depth of field. Let's go into it. So depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects giving a focused image. Now, that is not too bad, but it can be simpler. So let's scrap that and go with something a bit simpler to understand. Depth of field is the portion of your image that is not blurry. Say that again. It's the portion of your image that is not blurry. I'll go into a bit more detail with this one right now. So the depth of field, I love using monkeys, by the way. I think they respond well, correlates the word, well when it comes to children. Monkeys jump around, move, they don't sit still, pretty much like our children. So in our first image, you can see the middle monkey, the yellow monkey, is the one that's in focus, which means our depth of field is actually going from there to there. Now if we look at the second one, our depth of field is a bit larger, so we've got the blue and the pink monkeys included, which means our depth of field, with the portion of the image that is not blurry, goes from the blue monkey all the way to the pink monkey. And then in our bottom image, our depth of field is as large as it can go, which means everything is not blurry. So that's depth of field. Not as complicated as it sounded in the beginning, is it? Now, f-stop. This is where things get fun. F-stop. Now, Google defines f-stop as a camera setting corresponding to a particular f-number. Now, I scrapped that. When I thought about it, that is correct. So I'll take that scrap back. But to make it easier, f-stop is just how we tell the camera how much of the image is to be in focus. Or if you want to flip it on its head, we can say f-stop is how we tell the camera how much of the image is to be blurred. So let's have a look again. So in the first one, only the yellow monkey is in focus, and if we tell the camera to use an f-stop of 5.6, it's saying use a small depth of field, meaning the yellow monkey only. Now if we were to increase that number and tell the camera to use, say, f-stop 8, we're telling it to increase the amount that's in focus, covering the blue and pink monkeys as well. And if we're to increase it even more, say f-stop 32, depending on your lens as to how far you can go with these numbers, everything will be in focus. So your f-stop is just how you tell the camera how much of it is to be in focus. So they're the terms you need to know. So we'll recap them real quick. Aperture, just how much light goes into your camera. You only really need to know that because it's a setting, it's the name of a setting on your camera. Now your depth of field, is the portion of your image that is in focus. F-stop is how we tell the camera how much of the image is to be in focus. So it's not, they seem complicated at the beginning, but when you actually break them down into plain English, they are much, much easier to understand. Now, oops, where am I? There we go. Now, let's learn how to use the aperture priority mode. See, this is why we need to know that term. So for this activity, it's time to grab your camera, the fun part. So what I want you to do is set your camera to the aperture priority mode. So on Canon, I don't know if you can see this, I've done the picture here just in case you can't see this too well. It's actually the AV on a Canon. So you flip your dial until your AV is selected. On a Nikon camera, it shows as an A, Olympus an A, and a Pentax or a Sony, I was going to say computer then, camera, is an AV as well. Now, this is what we're looking for. When I turn my camera on, this is the back of my camera. It will actually show me my f-stop number, f5.0 or f32.0. Each camera is slightly different as to where it shows, so you will have to play with your dials until you find which one is responsible for changing your f-stop number. On a Canon, it is actually this little bumpy one at the top. Well, on my 60, that's where it is anyway. So you do have to play with this one. I'm sorry, I can't give you the exact answer on that one. Have a play until you see that F number moving. And if you look through your viewfinder, by the way, this is the best photo I can get, taking a photo in this tiny little spot here. Sometimes it will not show with the F in front of it. So when looking through my viewfinder, all I've got is a 5.0. You may have that as well. It will take a little bit of getting used to. As we go further on in these modules, I'll explain what the other numbers are as well. Ooh, pardon me. But until then, that's the one you're looking for, the one that's got the point in it. So, once you've got your camera set to aperture priority mode, you will need a very bright room, just to make it easier on you at this point in time. With aperture priority mode, you're actually telling the camera, I want control of my f-stop number, you work out the rest. So by having a very bright room, it's going to make it easier on your camera to figure out the rest of your settings and still get a nice clear image. Okay, next you need a large flat space. The floor is excellent. However, if you have kids who are likely to interfere, maybe on a table, or I do have a solution to the kids getting in the way a little bit with this one. Now you'll need 5 small objects. Essentially, you only need 3. But let's face it, if the kids are home, they're gonna run off with them. So if you've got 5, you've got a few more to play with. And if they really run off with them, set up lots of them. First time I did this with my daughter, I ended up having to scrap it and start it all over again. So be patient and just have fun. If you want to include the kids, have fun with it. Now you need to set up the objects in a V shape, like so. If you have them about 15 centimeters apart, it will give you the best result in showing how your f-stop works and how to make that background blur. If you have them too close together, you're not going to get as much of a blur between them. So I do suggest at least 15 centimeters between each of the objects. And that nice V shape or an arrow shape, depending on how you're looking at it. So once you've got them set up in a V, you need to set your f-stop number to the smallest number possible. So remember, find the dial which moves that f-stop number and move it to the smallest number possible on your camera. Once we've done that, what we are trying to do by having it on the smallest number possible is the very first monkey image. We're trying to get just one of those items in focus and blur the rest. And by doing this activity, it will show you exactly how that works. So, this is an example. My lens goes as low as 4.0. I think, what was I? I was about 30 centimeters away from it when I took these images. Depends on what lens you've got as to how close you can get to your image, to your items. If you cannot get that first one in focus, move back a bit more and try again. Sometimes your lens will have a minimum amount of space before it will focus on an object. So you may have to move back a bit more before it'll work. That's just a little tip. So this one I had it on f-stop 4.0 and just the front object is in focus. That's the one I told the camera to focus on. Now, in the next image, I've actually moved the focus to the little O character from the movie Home, which is my daughter's favourite. So by focusing on that and having such a low f-stop number, my camera has automatically blurred both the back and the front images. This is because we're telling the camera the depth of field is only as big as that middle object. And the same holds true if I focus on the back object. The little blocks here. Everything else has been blurred out and then they are in focus because our depth of field is only very small. Now notice how the amount that is in focus is the same for each of these. The depth of field has not changed because our f-stop number has not changed. Just the item that has been focused on has changed. So I think in this case, each of those items were probably about 5 centimeters thick. So the depth of field would have only been about 5 centimeters. Now, let's flip that on its head and look at something with a very large f-stop number, which is our bottom lot of monkeys and trying to get everything in focus. So now we need to set our f-stop to the largest possible number. My lens in particular, I think, goes to 32. Some cameras will go even further and they can go to one called infinity, which means absolutely everything is in focus. So once you've got it set to the largest f-stop number, I actually went with 22, sorry, for this activity. Now, if your image goes a bit grainy or slightly blurry, do not stress too much. It just means the room is not bright enough for your camera to get the other settings quite right. We'll cover this later in the modules. So, I've got it set at f-stop 22. And once again, go through your 3 focus points. Focus on the first image, first object I should say, then the second object, and then the third object. And if you look through them, they are about the same amount of focus on each. None of them are really blurred out at all. Because your f-stop 22, your depth of field, covers all of those images, all of those objects, regardless of what you are focused on. And now it's time to play. I find aperture and your f-stops are so exciting because you can do so much with the blur. So now we're going to look at when to use aperture priority mode, specifically when it comes to taking photos of your kids. So, using a low aperture like f-stop 5.6 or lower is really good when you're focusing on the details of what your children are doing. This, for example, was my daughter's very first Lego creation that she had made on her own. So I wanted to capture that detail of that creation, because let's face it, it will never look the same again. Here I had the little man playing in the mud on a photo shoot, and I just wanted to capture those little hands playing with those toys in that mud. And I was just playing with my daughter and she decided I had to take a photo of the biscuit. But once again, it's the little details. So having that low f-stop number allows you to focus on the details in an image because it blurs everything else out. Now you can also use it to blur the background. It kind of goes hand in hand there. So you can blur out the background to bring focus to the children in the image. In this case, I've blurred the background to bring focus to her beautiful eyes. And once again, blurred the background to focus on the child in the front of the image. So, you use a low aperture to focus on the details, to blur the background, And you can also use it to blur the foreground of an image, so what's in front. So here I was actually shooting through some flowers, and by having the lower aperture I was able to blur the background and the foreground at the same time. Once again I was shooting through some leaves at this beautiful breastfeeding session, and I was able to blur the trees in the foreground. And here I was laying on the log itself, but by having that low aperture I was able to blur the log in front and behind her in order to bring the focus to what she is doing, which is simply reaching for those flowers. Now, when to use a large aperture. A lot of people would prefer to just use the lower one to get that nice lovely blur, but there are times when you have to use a large aperture. For example, if you want the entire background to be in focus. Here I wanted the water completely in focus as well, so I used a larger aperture. And here the detail in the scene was important to capture, so once again needed the larger one. Not particularly the middle one, but on the edges I really wanted to get the depth in the field, so I kept that larger aperture just to show how much space she was moving around in. Now, if there is more than one row of people, you may find that your second row or your third row, the faces end up blurring. If you use a large aperture number, this will correct that. So, if you have more than one row of people or dogs, using a large aperture number will make sure everyone's faces are in focus. Same here, everyone was jumping on Dad, but Dad is essentially the third row, so in order to keep him in focus I had to use a larger aperture. And here the guys are actually, from memory, I think they're about 40 centimeters apart. So by having that larger aperture it actually brings them to look closer together. And so that's the background. You use a larger aperture to keep the background in focus. If there's more than one row of people, and this is my tip especially when working with children, if they are moving quickly and in an open space, it can be really hard to get that focus on them without them being completely blurred. I find by having a larger aperture number while they're running around, you have more of a chance of getting them in focus rather than missing it entirely. So if the kids are moving quickly, a larger aperture number gives you more of a chance of capturing that movement without losing them to complete blur in the background. This little man was so cute. He started moving around a bit then, so I really had to dial up the aperture just to make sure I got him in focus without the background being in focus and him being blurry. Okay, so now you know the terms associated with blurring the background of a photo. So that's aperture, depth of field, and f-stop. Remembering aperture is just how much light goes into your camera. Depth of field is how much of your image is not blurry. And your f-stop is how we tell the camera how much of the image is not to be blurry. How to use your aperture priority mode. Simply flicking your dial to aperture and then using whatever button is associated with your camera to adjust your f-stop number and letting your camera deal with all the other settings for you. And when to use aperture priority mode. So we've covered when to use the low aperture, so with those little details, and when to use the higher aperture, when your kids are moving quickly or when you have a couple of rows of children that you want to be in focus. Now, this is your time to play. It's time to get your camera, turn this off, go out and have fun with your kids. Set up a game for them to play. While they're playing, play with your camera. You have a play too. Set your camera to a low f-stop and focus on the little details of what they're doing. See how you go with those images. Share them with us in the Facebook group. That's the Snap Happy Parents Collective if you haven't joined it yet, but hopefully I've sent you all the details so you have joined. Play with getting the entire scene of what they're doing in focus. Don't stress too much if your images are slightly blurry or a bit too grainy at this point. They are some other settings which we'll cover in modules to come. At the moment, just focus on deliberately blurring that background or deliberately keeping everything in focus. So make sure you share with us in the group. I want to see what you're doing. Now, in the next module, we're going to talk about why are the kids themselves blurry, and, depending on if you want to, how to do it deliberately or how to keep them in focus every single time. Until then, I'm Melly. I hope you've enjoyed Module 1, and I'll see you in Module 2. Love and kindness always. Mwah.